Hello, everyone. My name is Hangal Wright, and I'm the director of the Center for Culture, Identity, and Education here at the University of British Columbia. Welcome to the first of several events in the UBC Center for Culture, Identity, and Education series, #Black After February. Allow me to start by acknowledging that UBC is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam. Next, I'd like to thank our speaker for today, Dr. Henry Daniel, for launching the series. And I'd also like to thank Ezra Al-Mufta, who is the graduate assistant of the center and who is responsible for co-organizing the series with me. And of course, I'd like to thank all of you for being in the audience for this session. Now, the way we'll proceed is to have everyone's mic and video muted during Professor Daniel's talk. At the end of the talk, we'll have a robust Q&A session. For the Q&A, please your Zoom hand, and we will unmute your mic and turn on your video so you can make your comment or ask your question. Now, in the US and Canada, February is designated as Black History Month. On the one hand, there's something to be said for a dedicated period in which we acknowledge the presence, cultures, and historical and contemporary contributions of people of African descent in the Americas. On the other hand, the month of February has become, for most institutions, the only time that Blackness is acknowledged. This has led some of us who are Black to become cynical and to bemoan the fact that we were assigned the shortest and coldest month, and that we are in incredible demand to be Black for 1 month, after which Blackness is ignored. As a Black academic, every year I have felt the strange pressure to be Black for everyone for a month. The invitations to speak on panels, to give individual talks and interviews, to inform and evaluate other Black folks' work, etc., etc. Only for the end of February to be marked by an eerie silence about Blackness. Of course, we do not stop being Black after February, and it is ridiculous to think we matter only for a month. It is in response to this situation that I conceptualized the idea of developing a series of events on Blackness for the Center for Culture, Identity, and Education, purposely scheduled to occur after the month of February, that I'm calling #Black After February. We have the privilege of the company of Professor Henry Daniel of Simon Fraser University to launch the series. Henry Daniel is distinguished SFU professor, professor of dance, performance studies, and new media technologies. Daniel is a scholar, performer, choreographer, and artistic director of Full Performing Bodies. His research concentrates on strengthening notions of practice as research, which some call PAR, and research and creation in Canada. He leads a group of artists and scholars who help define new parameters for excellence in these areas. He has a professional background in dance, theater, and new media, with a career that started in his native Trinidad and Tobago and continued variously in the USA, in Germany, the UK, and now in Canada. His current research project, Contemporary Nomads, takes its inspiration from what cultural studies theorist Stuart Hall called the prototype of the modern or postmodern New World nomad, continually moving between center and periphery. The title for Professor Daniel's talk for today is Fitting, Outfitting In. So something of an abstract of this talk. How does one go about decolonizing a mind, starting with one's own? This is a question the Kenyan writer Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o, author of De-colonizing the Mind, wrestled with. Part of Ngũgĩ's solution was to go back to writing in his indigenous tongue, where I believe he felt more embodied in the rhythm, syntax, meter, color, and tone of the language. But where is Ngũgĩ now? He's at a US university in California. Perhaps the way for us who have been deprived of our indigenous languages is to resist the dominant forms of discourse that continue to foster popular, contemporary, and historic biases must take place in the spaces between the verbal and the nonverbal. And if so, the arts must play a key role in these initiatives. How then do we get the relevant bodies to help decolonize the physical spaces of the institutions we are hired to teach in? And how can we permeate the strategic barriers that have been erected to protect disciplinary domains? And how can we react to the rhetoric of a dominant discourse that continues to shape the minds and bodies of those who are charged to educate? These are the issues that Professor Daniel is going to help us address today. So without too much more ado, I should mention also one thing about Henry Daniel's work. He and I have had lots of discussions around the field of cultural studies, and I'm always brought back to the idea of the body and the performative. Henry is almost like my conscience about the body and the performative in the ways in which we think about work and the ways in which we theorize and the ways that knowledge itself is embodied. So that's my own personal notes on what his work means to me. With that as something of an introduction, and I turn it over to Professor Henry Daniel. Over to you, Henry.
Thank you, Handel. Good morning, everyone. So Handel already did a land acknowledgement, but I would also like to say that I'm quite happy to be working on the lands of the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh. And I've been here for the last 21 years. And I'm very happy to be able to address you all from Simon Fraser University School for the Contemporary Arts, where I've been teaching all this time. I want to take just a quick minute to introduce you to this book. You might probably see the words in an opposite direction because of the screen, but I'll be reading from this new book. It's titled Nuances of Blackness in the Canadian Academy, Teaching, Learning, and Researching Wild Black. And the authors are Awad Ibrahim, Tamari Kitosa, Melinda Smith, and of course, Handel Wright. And I'll be reading my contribution in that book, an essay titled Fitting, Outfitting In. And you have to excuse me because I am covering my screen now with a copy of the essay. So I'm hoping that my eyes can still engage with you. Here we go. A prologue. Who is he fooling? And what is he really doing there? They encountered each other in the parking lot, the one that was reserved for upper administration. The dean looked at the professor, who was on his way to another parking lot much further away, and started voicing what he probably thought was a compliment. Stopping abruptly, he tried to swallow the final words of the sentence. You look so much better. The professor smiled politely. Both knew exactly what the rest of the sentence was going to be, and both silently agreed not to pursue the issue. The professor had cut his dreadlocks. After all, he thought, the dean seemed like a mensch, and surely didn't intend any bias. In fact, he was the one who encouraged the professor when the latter's $1 million grant application to set up a performance research center was not allowed to leave the university on grounds that it was not likely to succeed at the federal level. The inside story was that an assistant professor without tenure in the arts facility wouldn't have much chance of success at that level. This dean was also the same one who commented on the professor's hiring interview that the job was contingent on completing his PhD, even though the requirement for the position specified an MFA or equivalent experience. The professor was ABD at the time, with an MA and an extensive and enviable international career at the highest professional level in his field. Back then, he still had his dreadlocks. Now, in the parking lot more than 7 years later, and with his title changed to associate professor, he had shed them. The dean had also retired, but was recalled to head a new faculty. Who am I, and what am I really doing here? Why am I really here? I remember precisely when and where and why I first started growing dreadlocks. It was a long time ago in the Caribbean, before I became a professional dancer and choreographer. My last attempt came out of pure frustration. I had gotten tired of driving the 3 hours from Münster to Amsterdam every time I needed a haircut. Why not grow some dreadlocks again? Now, a few years on from the comment in the parking lot, with more than a little salt and pepper on my head and the title of full professor next to my name, I wonder about the numerous slips of the tongue I had experienced from colleagues and strangers en route. Who am I fooling? And why am I really here? Do I really look much better without my dreadlocks? Why did I shed them? And why are they still lying in the top drawer of my cupboard amidst the socks and underwear? And how many other discarded masks still lie in the cupboards of my house? The term fragmented subjectivities comes to mind. 4 different deans and a number of institutional reorganizations at the faculty and departmental level later, and I'm still trying to fit into a system that continues to see me as other. Tracy McMullen riffs on Curtis Mayfield's gospel-inspired "People Get Ready, There's a Trainer Coming," 1965. She claims that there is no need to get ready for a future that is already here. McMullen also suggests that the African-American tradition of improvisation offers perspectives and notions of the self, hope, and the future that reveals a great deal about being in a world that, quote, does not erect fictitious boundaries around a self that cannot, in fact, be located, unquote. My essay, Performing the Now, Mingus's Pithecanthropus erectus, 2017, looks at the life and work of musician-composer Charles Mingus. Following McMullen, it argues that the post-colonial, post-slavery, post-institutional self does not quite exist, and thus has little to prop itself up against or gather around. It can, however, begin to recreate itself as an individuality through a constant search by way of a strategic set of improvisational ideas that eventually open up possibilities for becoming. Daniel, 2017. I think about what I have become, or rather about what I have given up to become. Who am I fooling? And what am I really doing here? Do I really look much better without my dreadlocks? Under whose gaze? Fitting, outfitting in. This chapter concerns itself with the performativity of identity from the perspective of a Black male artist and scholar working in a school for the contemporary arts within the Canadian university system. Having spent the greater part of my life in countries outside my own native land and in the professional arena as dancer, performer, choreographer, media artist, and scholar, one can say that I have acquired a fair degree of experience about the nature of discourses on performance and the performativity of identity. Since I regularly lecture on and challenge many of these ideas in my intellectual and artistic work, at the same time encouraging my students to do the same, the thematic of this book gives me an opportunity to comment on some of my experiences within a wider context. 3 issues compound the challenges someone like me faces in an average day. The first is that my job as a dance and performance studies scholar sits squarely in the realm of what is known as research creation in Canada, and as such, is considered already on the margins of valid academic research. Second, in promoting an approach to art scholarship that intersects with a wider spectrum of disciplines, I am often confronted with the borders that many of these disciplines erect to protect their domain. Third, my own immigrant Caribbean Black African slave ancestry background makes me extremely sensitive to what I see as a certain colonization of minds that the dominant forms of discourse foster within academia, and the difficulty people like me encounter in trying to offer alternative approaches. The point here is that I am no stranger to the prejudices constituted against race, language, academic discipline, and all the other subtle and not so subtle discriminatory practices the guilty face inside and outside academia. Given that many of these biases are grounded in historically established configurations of inequality and affect what takes place in the classroom, the boardroom, in adjudication panels where research funding priorities are determined, and in hiring, promotion, and tenure committees where one's performance is being assessed, this chapter is a study in fitting in, as I am tasked to help outfit a generation of students who, all too often, are more concerned with what they are entitled to than what unique potentials exist in such settings. So, what's your background? Most of us working in the arts are fairly acquainted with some form of this question. I call it the establishing an artistic genealogy question. We always want to know what others' artistic lineage is, how they got to where they are now, and who their mentors or artistic influences were along the way. In many ways, the question is similar to another ambiguously worded one, that people who have one or another language, accent, racial origin, or deviation from some tacitly agreed norm encounters. This is the "where are you from?" or "where are you really from?" question. When positioned within the context of academia, where disciplinary categories, theoretical and conceptual frames within particular knowledge fields, and the impact value of one's own research within a socio-political economic sphere plays a larger role in situating someone's work, these questions converge in a dynamic space that generates a great deal of tension, not to mention misunderstandings and downright fallacies. To put it another way, a wide range of personal and institutional prejudices comes into play. And when the neoliberal politics of university administrators are added to the mix, important things get sacrificed. To be fair, the above mentioned questions are often asked out of sheer curiosity, and sometimes in an unguarded or naive manner to elicit information, start a conversation, or simply to check out the competition. However, these situations also present a rich field of investigation for people like me, artists, scholars, whose research involves detailed examinations of human beings performing their way through the structures of privilege, entitlement, and institutional power. These mises en scène are composed of so many different layers that it is not difficult to lose one's sense of self while playing a number of scripted roles. Acknowledging that others genuinely want to know more about one's background to better locate one in the intellectual machinery, so to speak. The issue soon becomes one of how far can such performances last before one or more of the many layers or masks we perform begin to reveal themselves. The fascinating thing about these encounters is that no matter what one suspects about the nature of one's own exclusion from particular orbits of institutional power, there is almost never any overt admission of such exclusivity until the proverbial slip of the tongue. When such slips occur, and they infrequently do, the supporting cast can be left with debilitating feelings of being mere placeholders, fulfilling some kind of institutionally mandated role that helps promote a vaguely articulated notion of inclusivity. To put it even more colorfully, one can find oneself playing the role of the spice that adds taste to a dish, but that must not be confused with being the meal itself, or even having a real influence on the decisions made at table. Such realizations are always painful for the ego. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, the stories I have to tell here are minor narratives in a larger discussion on notions of diversity and inclusivity, or what I call here fitting, outfitting in. First of all, how does one fit into a paradigm, research or otherwise, that essentially ignores the validity of one's dance, choreographic, and performance practices as critical modes of knowing? Second, how can such embodied practices inscribe themselves within institutions of power where the actors themselves and the very methods they use to investigate that knowledge are already perceived as unworthy or barely tolerable at the margins of serious research? Third, who constructs the ontological and epistemological basis that can support this type of knowing, and or the perceptive lenses and inscriptive practices through which such knowledges can be recognized and promoted? These are all extremely difficult questions to even begin to consider here. Unless they are faced head on, I believe the particular colonization of minds that currently substitute for real critique in certain quarters of the academy will continue. More importantly, unless there is a critical mass of these bodies of difference in the practice room and lecture halls of the academy to engage in such dialogue, we are being profoundly delusional in our use of the terms diversity and inclusivity. A colleague of mine spoke quite frankly at a recent scholarly gathering about the fact that there are quite distinct approaches to and notions of diversity and inclusivity in the part of Canada from which I write. Acknowledgement comes first for the First Nations community. After all, the term itself undeniably calls for such recognition. After this comes the Chinese-speaking community and the substantial contributions they make to help keep the economy vibrant, an economy that relies to a great extent on a booming real estate business and a growing tech industry. Third in line comes the South Asian or Indian community, who form a powerful and important cultural presence. And only then, if there is any goodwill left, could one perhaps begin to talk of a Black community. Having experienced this prioritization as an unwritten rule in my years of living amongst this diverse community, I understood what my colleague meant. These statements, to my mind, were certainly not derogatory or prejudicial by any stretch of the imagination. However, this individual was called to task by a member of the audience, another colleague, who warned against articulating a tendency toward discrimination against Asians that was already tacitly promoted in the community. Theoretically, I saw her argument. However, I felt the point became lost amidst a particular kind of sensitivity or institutional practiced conservatism that always seems to mollify glaring problems that require address. At the same time, drawing attention away from policies that are themselves inherently discriminatory. Caught in such a set of maddeningly contradictory circumstances, one is forced to take a step back and evaluate one's own position within what could easily turn into what Walcott calls competitive oppression exceptionalism. Such attitudes serve no helpful purpose whatsoever, and indeed create even more unwanted tensions within and across racial groups. One could be forgiven for asking whether we can ever move away from such dichotomized modes of thinking. What then are we really trying to achieve here? And what could be the role of the artist as intellectual within a system that not only ignores the potential of such a presence, but actively forces it into a set of frames that deny its very potential? Indeed, one can ask whether it is really possible for new theoretical and conceptual frames to emerge from an institutionalized framework that forces people like me to fit in to something that fundamentally was not designed to accommodate difference. Admittedly, these same questions have dogged my extended residence in countries on both sides of the Atlantic throughout a professional career as dancer and choreographer. Then, however, the issue had more to do with how I saw myself being presented within the framework of other people's choreographic ideas, and my own struggle to articulate an individual creative voice that could speak about such a predicament. These international performance stages were precisely the locations where bodies like mine desperately strove to train a particular type of gaze, one that could offset the negative effects of a colonial past. Now, as a scholar, I encounter some of the same institutional barriers, And I am again forced to ask, when will we be ready for such conversations? And in what kinds of forms will these conversations come? Damned if I can, damned if I can't. If I'm cast in the role of trying to perform new identities for my own survival, then perform I must. However, and in the meantime, the feeling persists that one's greatest performances come from daily trying to negotiate a space to exist within institutions that do not truly recognize the modes of knowing and the structures for framing that knowledge that people of difference bring. We always seem to be trying to fit into an uncomfortably limited and limiting space that, and for bodies and minds accustomed to wide open physical and mental vistas, this is quite disconcerting. Where are you from? I mean, where are you really from? These two questions, especially when they follow one another, always provoke a deep sense of frustration and a consequent re-examination of the notion of self that any person of color, immigrant, or outsider feels within a system. Identity and the structures of identification one finds oneself inhabiting is so complex that one always wonders which you is really under examination. Responses can be dangerous. Which part of me is out of place? And why does it appear to others that I do not belong? These are more than rhetorical questions. They are foundational aspects of what one is and or intends to become, and hence profoundly philosophical. As the only tenured Black faculty member in a department of more than 30 full-time faculty, and perhaps a further quarter of that number of part-timers, I am already a minority. But is race really the only criterion that determines the issue of belonging or fitting in? And are there other less obvious criteria that are being applied that I am unaware of? When my mostly white and mostly female students in a studio class comment on what they see as a cultural approach to the physical practices that I offer, what exactly do they mean? And what about the more diverse student population in my lectures and seminars, and the theoretical approaches and perspectives that I offer there? Since the sum total of this material is not necessarily Black by any stretch of the imagination, does the comment about a cultural thing mean that it's not original, or that the material is in some way flawed? In Rotterdam, where I was once a guest artist, I had the director at a well-known contemporary dance academy call my studio practice Afro-Caribbean Limon. This person was referring to my approach to a dance technique I was trained in at the Juilliard School and performed through repertory works in the Jose Limon Dance Company of New York for many years. It amused me that this colleague chose to ignore the fact that all of these so-called modern and or contemporary dance techniques have had substantial input from Black bodies throughout their development. Input that is unacknowledged in many of the written histories that continue to be disseminated. Ironically, he also recognized that there was something I added to the technique simply by performing it. This point is lost on many of these writers who should actually know better. Another relevant point is that during each day, I do not encounter more than 3 or 4 Black students on my way through the halls of the department I teach in. Very rarely do I have 3 at the same time in any of my lecture courses. And never have I had more than 3 at any one time in the studio courses that I teach. This is quite shocking for someone whose work attempts to address precisely such absences. However, the more important issues at stake here and the questions that need to be asked should be, where are these people and why are they not here? Do my teaching practices or those of colleagues like me across the university not accommodate what they are looking for? Of course, it could simply be that there are not many of us, people of color, in the city in the first place, or that those who are around do not think the programs offered are worthy of their time and effort. Whatever the case, the onus seems to be on me to go find and invite them in, which in turn poses the question, is that part of the reason I was hired in the first place? Am I expected to go find and bring these diverse student populations into the institution? And if this is indeed the case, why aren't my substantial and ongoing efforts to do so not being supported by said institution? Growing up in a place where we were taught that Columbus discovered the Americas more than 5.5 centuries ago, and that he was followed by others who brought our ancestors here through an ignominious trade, the issue of how to go about dismantling deeply embedded modes of thinking has always been of concern to me. But how does one go about decolonizing a mind? Starting with one's own. This is a question the Kenyan writer Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o himself wrestled with. Part of his solution was to go back to writing in his own indigenous tongue, where I believe he felt more embodied in the rhythm, syntax, meter, color, and tone of the language. Perhaps the way for us who have been deprived of our indigenous languages to resist the dominant forms of discourse that continue to foster the types of biases I mentioned earlier must take place in the spaces between the verbal and the non-verbal. And if so, the arts must play a key role in these initiatives. How then do we get the relevant bodies to help decolonize the physical spaces of the institutions we are hired to teach in? And how can we permeate the strategic barriers that have been erected to protect disciplinary domains? Lastly, what options do people like me have? Those of us with a background embedded in a history of slavery and colonization. How can we react to the rhetoric of a dominant discourse that still continues to shape the minds and bodies of those we are charged to educate? These questions will certainly not be addressed without the establishment of a certain critical mass. But where will that critical mass come from? Oh, you're a professor. What do you teach? My first response to these questions is almost always to say that I teach dance, or that I teach theater and performance studies. This, of course, elicits the inevitable follow-ups. What kind of dance? And what is performance studies? You mean you can actually get a PhD in dance? By this time, I'm already preparing for the upcoming explanation of what studies in dance, theater, and performance studies actually entail. More importantly, perhaps, I try to explain how all of these interests combine to form a comprehensive approach to teaching scholarship, and research. Amidst the genuine surprise and obvious confusion, I'm usually enjoying the entertainment for what it's worth, trying to discover more about the nature of the personality standing in front of me. The scene is a truly fascinating one, and the reader would be correct in thinking that any anthropological and or auto-ethnographically minded person would already be constructing a case study. Kafka's Ape Revisited, if you wish. And if, as Red Peter, one is consigned to a continual reportage of gratefulness to the Academy for enabling one's Entwicklung, or evolutionary development, then one can be forgiven for seeing the entire charade for what it is worth. An extended and ongoing performance of identity that's taken more than half a century to unfold. Walcott and others are indeed correct in their observations. His claim that, quote, the colonial history that gave rise to a contemporary life in the West still haunts our present, is evident in all aspects of these same everyday lives. Perhaps already sensing what lay ahead, soon after my own appointment as an assistant professor in a Canadian university, I created a new dance and performance work titled Relatively Well-Centered 2000. This would be the first in Canada of a choreographic model I had begun developing much earlier in the UK and other parts of mainland Europe, mostly Germany, in academic, professional, and community dance institutions. This model included using students I was assigned to teach in a number of different disciplinary areas, faculty members from across the university, and professional artists working in the real world outside academia. To my mind at the time, the response to this first work was quite strange. I thought either no one understood the work or my colleagues were too polite to comment about what they saw. I received absolutely no critical feedback outside the cast and creative team, something that baffled me, since I assumed that in such an environment, critical dialogue was expected, encouraged, and even demanded. Even gentle probing failed to squeeze much out of my colleagues. Relatively Well-Centered utilized text from Franz Kafka's Ein Bericht für eine Akademie, a report to an academy, 1917. Mary Evans's I Am a Black Woman, 2007, and Virginia Woolf's Orlando, 1928. Its aim was to explore some of the issues that were inherent in these writings and the critique of culture, gender, race, and the academic enterprise that they posed. The work was also part of a larger strategy to position dance and other performance practices as valid modes of investigation and as strategies for knowing, able to hold their own within any intellectual pursuit. Relatively Well-Centered, as the title suggests, looked at how bodies within a system enter a state of dynamic equilibrium. In this case, how they become relatively fixed in elliptical paths or orbits around one another. This habit of drawing inter- and transdisciplinary references is strategic to both my studio practices and my intellectual and theoretical work. Indeed, it is a crucial aspect of a research methodology that attempts to look at the simultaneity of human being in its complex dimensions. Such an approach underlies the idea that we human beings enjoy an existence in bodies that have complex histories, are embedded in multiple domains, have cells and memories that exist simultaneously in different spatio-temporal orbits, and can be investigated by methodologies that do not obey prescriptive disciplinary categories. Relatively well-centered utilized the basic concept embedded in an ellipse, which describes a trajectory that is quite different from that of the circle. The structure of the circle is described by an object that sits at the center of a path in relation to another object that rotates around it with equal radii everywhere. The ellipse, on the other hand, suggests that there are two centers around which an object travels, one visible and the other invisible. The visible center pulls the rotating object towards it, while the invisible source of energy drags it away such that the viewer sees an elongated path. The idea behind this mise-en-scène was that for every performer on stage, an invisible force existed that shaped the movements of the orbiting subject. One could read into this the idea that every phenomenon or movement action is influenced by two main sources, one visible and the other invisible, which together stabilize a moving subject into an elliptical path. In short, there are always at least three forces at work that determine an individual's actions, and these forces are never equal. In Relatively Well-Centered, all of the white performers on stage were shadowed by pre-recorded images of Black bodies on a screen behind, creating a doubly centered elliptical path with the audience as observing subjects. Additionally, the entire music in the work consisted of African-influenced drumming patterns, voice, and percussion executed by the only Black colleague I had in the department, a highly skilled musician lecturer who had spent decades accompanying dance classes in the department and running a biennial field school to Ghana until his retirement in 2015. However, none of this music was obviously recognizable as such, since it was electronically manipulated into something quite other than. My musician colleague never appeared live on stage, nor did I, but we were both forces instrumental in determining the trajectory of the audience's perspectives. This, in short, was my critical response to the fact that the program had so few persons of color visibly at work in the current structures and systems of institutional power. This, to be sure, was just one layer of the work. The other layers spoke for themselves, and audibly so, through the text of Franz Kafka's Report, Woolf's Orlando, and Evans's Black Woman. This initial effort to introduce what I hoped would stimulate critical dialogue was met by polite silence. Even as I sought feedback, no one said a word about what I saw as the most important aspect of the work, namely, how to introduce a lively debate about diversity and inclusivity through an individual practice, and to offer a critique of the institution that seemed not to encourage what it was actually advertising as part of its social and educational mandate. A decade later, and after much effort in developing new works with varying degrees of criticality, I re-choreographed and restaged a section of relatively well-centered as The Report. This time, just using Kafka's text in the original German with the translation of my former playwright colleague, Mark Diamond. The report presented white bodies performing classical ballet steps en pointe, steps transformed by a contemporary vocabulary that challenged the ballet's own form of institutionalization of dance. The ape role was reprised by the original Canadian-Filipino actor-performer. There were no references to Black bodies or their virtual representation on stage in this version. However, my attempts to create inter, cross, and transdisciplinary dialogues, to position studio-based or process-based research with dance on a more secure footing with other forms of academic research continued. And if I might say so, with much success internally via university-based grants and externally via multi-year federal funding. What's ahead? Those of us with a past embedded in the experience of the Atlantic slave trade have inherited a peculiar relationship to the descendants of those who enslaved our forefathers and the institutions they created to keep them in check. We have become trapped in each other's orbits, rooted in each other's gazes, if you wish. Escape demands becoming something other than, radically shifting a focus that forever recreates and or perpetrates an illusion that presumes its own truth. But what could this radical shift be? And from whence can it come? I firmly believe that a new and more diverse set of bodies must infiltrate and thus radically change the current institution and the discourses it attempts to proliferate. These bodies must challenge what has become normative, actively promote shifts in perception, and expose the many possibilities that lie hidden between the yes-no subject-object dichotomies of an inherited rationalist mode of thinking and being. As McMullen argues, we are dealing with a future that is already here, and something other than that must describe that future. I don't subscribe to your version of diversity. I don't believe in its inclusivity practices. I don't wish to represent anything. I want to make work that contributes to a radical perceptual shift. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry. I think we've all really enjoyed that. So Ezra has put in the chat that if you have questions, please use the raised hand option. And I see there's at least, I was going to say, there are things that came to my mind as I listened to you, even starting from your dreadlocks in the beginning. So, maybe I'll start off with that as one question that I could ask before I turn it over to the audience. Just ask you to speak a bit more personally or more broadly about the politics of hair and the performance of your cutting off your dreadlocks, and something about maybe what it meant to you. You talked about growing dreadlocks almost like it was a practical decision. But dreadlocks have so many different meanings. Yes. And such politics attached to them from the religious of Rastafari, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm wondering if you can say, and we know that hair or loss of hair is in the news these days after the Oscars around Black people's hair. Can you elaborate a little bit about the politics of hair and that performance of your, of your cutting off of your dreadlocks?
Mm-hmm. Yes, Handel. It's quite complex. And I would start by saying that one of the things that I was really interested in when I wrote this essay, and also I have a book that's coming out in the summer where I elaborate on some other issues. Very often, one does things almost kind of, as you say, practically or naturally. And then one discovers later on, sometimes the profundity of those decisions that one makes. I started growing dreadlocks first after I left my Presbyterian high school background. You would not, could not, absolutely not grow dreadlocks in that context. You could not. This was a secondary school that was founded by Canadian Presbyterian ministers, an all-boys school for the sons of East Indian indentured servants after the slave trade finished. So that was the environment in which I went to school in. Very strict. We wrote examinations from the University of Cambridge, and those examinations were sent off to England, corrected, and sent back down to the Caribbean. So that kind of environment, you cannot grow dreadlocks. You would not be allowed to. So the first time I started growing dreadlocks, I felt it was okay. I could do this now, but there was not any deep religious or profound kind of, in a sense, resistance involved. And I cut those dreadlocks when I became a professional dancer, because in many ways, at that time, you really had to be almost kind of, what would I say? I mean, your presence on stage in many ways presumed a certain kind of identity, or maybe lack of identity, I'm not quite sure. And when I decided to grow those dreadlocks again, I was living in Germany. And again, part of it was a kind of practicality, but also being masked by a certain kind of resistance, if you want to call it that. And I couldn't find a barber in Germany where I was living, a Black barber. I was living in Münster. So I had to travel 3 hours, drive to Amsterdam to find a barber. So, I mean, it's fascinating, these kind of stories. And I kept those dreadlocks until I came to Canada. And for some reason, after I think maybe 3, 4, maybe even 5 years, I decided to cut those dreadlocks. And that response hit me deep, but very typically, I smiled in that moment, because it was almost like a kind of habit that we are trained into, not to show an obvious resistance and to take everything on the cheek, so to speak. That was part of my own growing up. And in a sense, what I'm saying is also a line in this abstract. How does one decolonize one's own mind? and what are the processes that one must go through to be able finally to speak up. And how does one speak up after years of being trained not to speak up or to take everything on the cheek, so to speak? So when I mentioned the idea of the dreadlocks, in many ways that hit me deep in many ways about this notion of what does decolonization mean? What are its facets? What are its scenarios? I actually have a wonderful Jamaican barber who said to me once, you know, I see all these professors with their dreadlocks, and it's just like, it's a joke to me, because they have no idea of the Rastafarian background in terms of what these dreadlocks actually mean. And you see very prominent professors with dreadlocks, very long dreadlocks. And I really understood what he meant, because he grew up in that environment in Jamaica. And he knew the seriousness, the deep religiosity of that practice. So here we are playing these roles. And one asks, well, who are you playing these roles for? But even more surprisingly, I could go now, I'm just about 12 feet away from my bedroom. I could go to my bedroom closet right now and pull those dreadlocks out of my drawer. Why are they still there? I asked myself that, why are my dreadlocks still in my drawer with all the socks? Is it something that I'm really attached to? Am I hoping to stick it back on one day? Why are they there? You know, so it's a kind of a self-examination, a self-critique that one goes through in all of these scenarios, whether it's encountering a dean in a parking lot who says, you look so much better, but sorry, what does that mean? How does my exterior influence people, my students, my colleagues? And I suppose every one of us, we ask ourselves those questions, whether you're Black, whether you're white, whether you're brown, these issues come up. But then again, it seems as if the darker you are, the more often they come up. I hope that answers some of the
questions. No, it does. It does elaborate on things very nicely. I want to open this up. I see Lerato has a question for you. Go ahead, Lerato. Ezra, if you could turn on Lerato's video, please, and unmute her.
I'm unmuted, but no video. Thank you so much for that talk, Dr. Daniel. I'm so appreciative of being in space with you today and to be able to have these kind of conversations. I guess my question is just broader, more general, stemming from your presentation and well, your lecture really. How do you maintain balance? How do you stay in the space of hope, right? Of wanting to transform in the institution when all of these pieces of who you authentically are, you have to keep kind of shedding or stripping or morphing. I'm trying to think about how you maintain this space between being a positive disruptor, true to yourself and your Blackness and your identity, and not being seen as a troublemaker, right? And especially for someone in my position, being in a staff position where your employment is tenuous at different times. Yeah, I'm just interested what's kept you going and kept you in the light in the work you do, given some of those experiences that you shared with us today.
Okay, I'll start with another analogy. In Trinidad, we have something called a calypso. And in Jamaica, they have something called, whether it's reggae or whether it's rocksteady or whatever it is. But these two types of music are so different. And the reason why I mention that is I've always admired Jamaicans for their almost like revolutionary bluntness. You know, they have this energy and this idea of confrontation that I really love. And in Trinidad, we have this calypso. It's almost as if we laugh and we smile and we dance to pain. And this is just my own personal view. And somehow, maybe it's the environment I grew up in, whatever it is. When I was very young, I was different. I had a grandmother who was, I mean, like, wonderful matriarch, but a terror, you know. And I stood up to her, and I would be like so aggressive or whatever it is. And somehow that changed. And I became a little bit more smiley and almost, what was some of the words I'm looking for? Almost flirtative in a way sometimes. It was almost like I was avoiding confrontation. And I realized later on in life why I was avoiding confrontation. Because in my early life, I had paid the price for confrontation, not just with my grandmother, but in school. I mean, I was whipped, you know, as they say in secondary school. If you came to school without your tie in that boys' school, you'd be taken up to the dean's office and whipped with a guava whip. Yeah, I remember the first job I had in Trinidad, I was working in the central bank, you know, and I even confronted the head at one point because I didn't like the kind of policies that were going on in that bank. So I was a troublemaker, or I was a resistor, and I realized I wasn't getting anywhere. I realized that there was even a bigger force coming at me the more I resisted. And somehow, I think my strategy changed, or maybe I gave up, or maybe I changed my strategy. And I think you may have to ask some of my colleagues. I think somehow that there is this thing that's always seething, but I try to put a nice face on it, and I try to understand other people, because I see what some of my colleagues are also going through, not necessarily Black people. Maybe I can put it this way. I've lived in 5 different countries, and I've seen so many different kinds of ways of living, worked in so many different kind of institutions, and seen so many different kinds of people being, in many ways, put under or disenfranchised, that I realized that there's a whole lot of us others who are going through some of the same things that I probably went through. And I've, in many ways, I think I found maybe some kind of maybe humanity. I don't know, but there is always this little hope that I have. And when I go to teach my classes, especially my studio classes where I have people in a room moving, those are the places I feel most free in many ways. I enjoy teaching, and I feel as if I'm giving something, even though some of it might not be completely appreciated. I feel as if I'm giving something to a group of people and sharing something in that studio space. So maybe with all that I've said in terms of how my attitude has transformed, how I understand what it means to confront, and sometimes confront almost like rigidly, no holds barred, what it is like maybe to try a different approach. And I'm trying to balance when to use which strategy at this time in my life. So I don't know if I'm answering your question fully. How do I really negotiate these spaces? When do I have hope? When do I get completely frustrated? When do I shout? When do I smile? How do I negotiate being who I am in a space that wasn't initially created to accommodate me? Maybe I'm even complicating the question that you're asking. Are you still there? Hello? Hello?
I'm not sure if Lorato's still there, but I love the answer. I think it was. I think it was full and robust, and you got at a lot of. Oh, she says she's muted, and I can.
Okay.
It could be that the irrepressible Ezra has had to step away. So she's there, but
no, I'm trying to unmute.
Okay.
Whenever, let's see.
Okay, hi, I am.
okay, now she's unmuted. Okay.
No, you
So
did.
Did Henry answer your question?
Absolutely. I was just like going a lot on my end here. And I really resonate with the idea of finding humanity, you know, and really that whole idea of meeting people where they're at and figuring out what that means for you. And I think that's some of the navigation I'm doing on my personal journey. So thank you very much. I'm very appreciative of your answer.
And it can be exhausting. You know that probably yourself.
Certainly. Thank you.
So are there any more questions? I made the executive decision for us to move beyond an hour, which is, you know, my right, because this was supposed to be an hour, but I think you will all agree that we've heard a lot that has been stimulating, and so I've pushed this to 15 minutes further, but I think we can take a final question, which we have from Kristen. Please go ahead.
Hi, Henry. It's really nice to see you, and thank you for the talk. I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit more about the polite silence around work, and when you were hoping that it would bring about a critical conversation. I have a long-time creative partner who is Black African, who from what he refers to as a ghetto in Soweto. And last year, we did our second documentary film and presented it at a conference for innovations in urbanism to address issues, you know, like apartheid, urban patterns, contemporary economic patterns, boundaries of fear, patriarchy. And a lot of it was the language of where of what he lives every day.
Was this Sechaba?
No, this wasn't Sechaba. This was a good friend, Thiong'o. And it was met with polite silence. Not by Sechaba, by the way. He had critical thoughts on it. But the reality is that even in Southern Africa, which is where the conference was, still a majority of the academic population is white, and so how does one? I just wondered if you could expand more on strategies of how one has that conversation, because we were so excited about this film and about the extraordinary, you know, what we thought was this really quite extraordinary new way of looking at the city. And it was just the only people who responded to it were people from the backgrounds of having been oppressed.
Mhm.
Literally, the entire rest of the population was silent. And so I just was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that strategy, because how else do we change the conversation? Otherwise, we just keep having the same conversations over and over, and nothing actually changes.
Yes. I
Thank
think,
you.
first of all, in institutions, you need to hire some of these people. And it's a tricky thing in the hiring process, because it also depends who is on those committees, and who really want there's a word in German, but I say it in English. You call them shit disturbers. How do you hire people like that, and who is on the committee who are able to hire people like that in institutions? On the other end, there is always one or two students who you will find want to go there, maybe just one or two. And as a professor, it's part of your job to encourage these kinds of discussions, or get some of these kinds of students to speak up, because there's always one or two somewhere. It may be just this one class or wherever it is. Now, in the performances that I do, it's really interesting that I find sometimes we have these talkback sessions. They're really awful. The talkback sessions, it's almost like you transfer some of the hesitancy into the room after people have just performed, and it to me, it doesn't really work. But strangely enough, you know, the thing that I find works really, really well, you have to have, if you have these performances, you have to have a bar, and you have to have an intermission, and you have to have people walking around. Maybe you could put input some of these of your team, so to speak, and listen to people talk. It's almost like you have these snoopers going around, because that's where you have some of the biggest, really interesting critique from audience members, because they're not in a formal situation where they feel they're being pressured to say something. Yeah, that's where I have found some of the really interesting critiques. And it's almost like you walk around with your ear to the floor and you listen. They probably don't even know who you are. And you get some of that feedback. If you put that within a wider circle, whether it's in a faculty or whether out in the society at large, it's almost like you have this team of interlocutors or listeners who are listening out where people feel free to talk. And that's where you get, I found, that's where you get some of the most interesting feedback, not in the more formal situations. The other place, for example, that I try to encourage it is with students, but that depends on how well you've, in a way, because students are looking at their grades and they're not going to say anything that they feel might disturb their grades. So you might find that you spend 3/4 of the semester assuring them that, you know, don't worry about your grades. Of course, they'd still be worrying. But at some point, somebody opens their mouth. And then when that person opens their mouth and begins to give maybe an honest critique, there's a kind of a generative thing that happens, and people feel a little bit free to speak. But that happens sometimes in their third year, or maybe 3/4 of the way through any particular class. I guess what I'm saying is you have to find non-formal ways or innovative ways of listening to what people are really saying, because that's the way you're going to get really critical feedback. And you're going to get feedback that is sometimes so blunt, you can't deny it. So in a ways, we've become so formal and so careful, not wishing to I don't even know if the word is hurt or disturb or a particular kind of environment, that we've almost silenced ourselves from giving really serious critique.
It's interesting as you say that. It's occurring to me too that as we increasingly do things on Zoom, those sort of informal opportunities are fewer and farther between.
Interesting. My wife said something to me just yesterday about Zoom, and she was saying that somehow Zoom, because we're so close up, it's changed the way we have relationship with people. So when we go back to this classroom, something has changed and we're not quite sure how to deal with it anymore. Yeah. I'm teaching right now a group of students in a technique class, and we've taken our masks off for the first time. I have taken my mask off for the first time yesterday. And this is after asking them, because I didn't know that they all wanted to take their masks off. So I said, who wants to take their mask off, who feels free enough? And everybody put their hands up. And I said, okay, I'll keep my mask on. And Kristen, I can tell you, I've been teaching those students since January. And the folks who I looked at yesterday, I didn't recognize them. I've only been seeing eyes. And when they took that mask off, they were different people. I can't explain it. They were very, very different people. And I'm looking at bodies all day. I'm looking at their bodies. I know the length of their arms, the length of their legs, the height of I'm looking at their entire bodies. But yesterday, those dancers were strangers. So I don't know, between Zoom, between coming back from Zoom, between intimacy, between distance, something has changed.
Thanks so much for the question, Christine, and thanks for your response.
Thanks so much, Henry.
I think we might have time for one last question, if we could sneak it in. It's already 11:26, and if we're gonna make this. So I think Gloria had a question in the chat, which maybe she wants to ask now. So
sure, thank you.
Gloria.
Thank you, Dr. Daniel. I'm wondering if you have considered the concept trauma in relation to resistance in your work. To me, when I encounter a discriminatory experience, my mind resists to recognize it as trauma, but my body doesn't lie and cannot hide the trauma that comes with that experience. Then it is my body that informs my mind. And so this process, I also see it as part of, the process of decolonization of my mind. And because my mind would automatically tell myself to brush it off the experiences as nothing, which is also, a way of trying to fit in. But then my body tells me otherwise. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that. Thank you.
Absolutely, Gloria. And what a wonderful question. Yes, absolutely, trauma. And it's very interesting because there are so many different degrees of trauma. And some of the more subtle, I don't know if trauma can ever be subtle, but some of the more subtle forms of trauma, the body that's carrying it sometimes doesn't realize that they're traumatized. And one of the ways that I think, because I spoke about the verbal and the non-verbal, one of the ways I think that the arts, and especially the movement arts, can address that trauma is the body does not lie. The body really doesn't lie. And we have something we call embodied cognition that, you know, we all talk about and write about until we understand really what embodied cognition means. And you can see it in these bodies, and you can see the transformation as it releases. That is performance like you cannot. I mean, you cannot imagine. And it's not just stage performances, it's our everyday way of being in space. And I think if there were more people who could actually recognize that in bodies, and I think maybe that's part of the surprise that I had in the class, because I was looking at these bodies and I was looking at these eyes. And when they took their masks off, there was such a different reading. Such a different reading. So yes, trauma in all its forms needs to be gotten out of the body. How do we get it out of the body? How can we speak up? How can we move up? In the book that's coming out, I have a particular kind of theme that I deal with. And I say, movement is the process of thought unfolding. And just think about that. Movement is the process of thought unfolding. And I speak about it and deal with it at length throughout the book, because I really feel there's a relationship. It's almost like if you think of physics, or if you think of the movement of electrons, or however you think of what level of movement there is. Here we are with this physicality and different levels, different degrees, different sensitivities. We walk through space and we encounter people, we encounter things, we encounter temperatures, we encounter so much. And every time we walk through a space, we have an opportunity to interact with what's in that space. And there can be trauma in a space that a body accumulates by walking into that space. Yeah. And you can bring trauma into a space that didn't have trauma before. So when we think of the relationship between the body and the space that it enters, and then we think of how we move through space, how we encounter others through space, how trauma is transferred, how trauma is released. I mean, there is so much I can go into that your question just releases so much, you know. So yes, I agree. And I think that there are ways in which we can get that trauma out of the body, release it, become free of it. And that's process of decolonization as well. But it starts with one's own self, you know. How can we decolonize our own minds? How can we realize that some of the things we're doing, we're actually supporting the structures that are keeping us there? And when you actually see that, and when you start experiencing that, sometimes you get so mad because you realize it's that thing, and maybe it's in an invisible thing, but it's holding you in a space that you don't want to stay in. You know, how can that space be freed of some of the things that are holding those bodies back? And it's all different kinds of bodies. Yeah. So I wish I could talk some more about that, or you can tell me some more about your situation. because in many ways that for me becomes an opportunity to create new works that allows you to share some of those issues. I mean, I know Kristen Kornienko, who just asked that question earlier, she goes regularly to South Africa to work. And as a white woman, she recognizes a lot of the trauma that happens in those spaces and the attempts to, okay, how can we release some of that trauma? Yeah. So it's a wonderful question. Thank you.
No, thank you so much.
Thank you. We're going to have to end there. We're over the hour-and-a-half limit. So thank you so much, Henry, for a stimulating discussion. And that's the book. I'm one of the co-editors of the book, and that is definitely, well, there's so many interesting contributions. Professor Daniels being just one of them. And as I said, I'm so glad that we spent some time today thinking bodily. And Gloria, I think your question was absolutely the most wonderful one to end on. And theorizing the body and theorizing with the body and making that, refusing that separation between our body and mind, which is Cartesian anyway. It's Eurocentric thought that separated them, and the work of people like Henry brings them back together in wonderful ways. So again, I want to thank you for being here, all of you as an audience. I want to thank Ezra for all her work, a continued work as a graduate assistant for the center and helping me with this series. And especially, please let's thank Professor Henry Daniel for a most stimulating talk and for taking the time to engage with us as an audience. So thank you very much, everyone. You'll be getting information about the series as it continues. So thank you all for being here. Okay.
It's a pleasure, and thanks for those wonderful questions. Remember, body, mind, and space.